The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University. This is EconVersations, a joint production of Troy Trojan Vision and the Manuel Johnson Center for Political Economy. Now, here's your host, Dr. Dan Sutter.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. Hugo Chavez was elected president of Venezuela in 1998 after an earlier unsuccessful coup attempt. Chavez enacted numerous left-wing economic policies, frequently described as another example of socialism. And when Chavez died from cancer in 2013, real GDP per capita in Venezuela was almost double where it was when he was elected. Was this an example of socialism working? Assessing the economic performance of a new leader or new economic policies is a very challenging question for economists. What methods do we use, and what do they show about Venezuela's economic performance since Chavez's election? Joining me on EconVersations to discuss his research on these questions is Dr. Kevin Grier, who is the Gordon Tullock Professor of Political Economy with the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech University. Dr. Grier earned a PhD in economics from Washington University, and prior to Texas Tech taught at George Mason, Tulane, and the University of Oklahoma. He has published dozens of highly cited papers in economics and political science. Welcome to EconVersations, Kevin.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me.
And I should point out to the authors, we've known each other for years, so we're friends for a number of years. So we're glad to finally have you on the show. And so we want to start here because we're going to be talking about some of your research that you've done with a couple of co-authors, looking at first Venezuela and then expanding that out as we'll talk about to some other countries in Latin America as well. So tell us a little bit, because we'll start and talk probably primarily about Venezuela. Tell us a little bit about Hugo Chavez and how he came to power. And I know he's a very highly polarizing figure. People think he's both great and then not so great.
Right. And that points out kind of, or emphasizes what you talked about, the challenge of evaluating outcomes, is that people will look at the same data and say Chavez did great, and then other people look at it and said Chavez did terrible. So that makes it quite a challenging enterprise. Anyway, he was elected, as you said, in 1998, had been a colonel in the army, had a failed coup, went to prison, was a long shot candidate, but came out of nowhere at the end and won the election in a somewhat surprising manner. And then immediately undertook to just redo Venezuela's economy, politics, society. He wanted to abolish the existing legislature, get rid of the old constitution, have a constitutional convention for a new form of government. When the Supreme Court ruled that he was doing this too fast and in the wrong sort of in an unconstitutional manner, he ended up putting a bunch of new justices on the Supreme Court that agreed with him and got that ruling reversed and got his constitutional convention and got his new constitution and got a supermajority in the new unicameral Congress and started to rule by decree with the power that his Congress had given him.
And one thing to note is that Venezuela is actually an oil-producing country. So it's in South America, but it's probably like the one South American country that really does export a lot of oil. So it does have some mineral resources here.
Yes, it's a member of OPEC. I think the only Latin American country that's a member of OPEC. And it's a very oil-dependent economy, right? It's not a diversified economy like the U.S. Basically a commodity exporter.
And he did undertake some policies like attempting to nationalize the oil industry and nationalizing some other industries, some other companies as well, right? So it wasn't just talk, it wasn't just political stuff. He was doing some economic restructuring, if you want to think of it that way.
So the oil industry was already a national, so he didn't nationalize it, but he took much more political control over it, taking out like leaders of the industry that had an engineering background and putting in as executives and as higher ups people that were more political agents. We did transform the national oil industry in that way, made it much more political.
Okay. And so another case that you look at in one of the papers was the case of Nicaragua. In fact, the first time that Daniel Ortega came to power in Nicaragua, but that was also advancing what would be, I guess at the time we would be calling it communist agenda, but there's certainly some left-wing or socialist policies in Nicaragua as well, right?
Yes, so this is 1979, 20 years or so before Chavez. The Sandinistas abolished the Constitution, abolished the presidency, abolished the legislature, abolished the national courts. They nationalized the banking system and the fishing industry. They nationalized about 20% of the arable land of the country, and so on and so on and so forth. Very much the government owns everything kind of an approach to running their country. Yeah.
So if we want to then turn it to economic performance, we have a couple of graphs here, and tell the listeners or our viewers here, they focus on the dark line on this, because what this is showing is for Venezuela's case, what happened to GDP per capita after Chavez's election. And we see that although it stagnated for a while, it did eventually take off and get to almost double the level it was when he was elected. So we could look at that and say, like, oh, well, I mean, slow start, but his policies, maybe it took a while for them to get going, but they looked, had some promising effects. And then we could look at Nicaragua here, and it's sort of like a cliff. They didn't do well. So we could simply look at these and sort of say, well, okay, Venezuela seems like maybe they could have actually been successful. Nicaragua, not so successful. But that's not a very good way of actually trying to assess what's going on in these countries, or to attempt to actually, I guess, more validly just evaluate what was happening due to these changes in economic policy. Is that?
No, I don't think it is. I mean, we always have to consider what would have happened without the policy change. What, like, people like me would call, what is the counterfactual?
Yeah.
So ideally, we would like to see Venezuela in 2010 with Chavez and Venezuela in 2010 without Chavez, but that's impossible. So we have to try and figure out, if we want to say what was the causal effect of Chavez, we have to figure out some way of saying what would have happened if he hadn't been there. And it's trying to come up with a counterfactual that makes these kinds of experiments or these kinds of analyses challenging.
Yeah, and so this is a big part of what economists are always trying to do, because we don't get to conduct like laboratory experiments. There's no way you can take Venezuela in 1998 and have an alternative history where Chavez doesn't come to power and directly compare these two, right?
Sure. I mean, like, ideally, it would be great if the United Nations could randomly assign 50 countries in the world to be run by left populists. And then we could just wait 20 years and compare the outcomes of them and the others, and just like like a drug trial, and we'd be very happy. But we can't do that. We can't randomly assign national policies. We can't randomly assign leaders, which means we just observe what happened, and it's up to us to come up with a convincing way to say what would have happened in the absence of that policy or in the absence of those leaders.
And another issue that, especially when you're looking at changing economic policies, is what economists refer to as the endogeneity of the policy, and the very fact that the policy might have been chosen for certain reasons that then is going to really mess up your attempts to try to do any kind of statistical analysis. It's sort of the same kind of thing you'd see. It's like, well, hospitals are very dangerous places. People go to hospitals and they die there at a very high rate. But it's obviously not because of that. But it's the same kind of issue that we would face in any attempt to evaluate economic policies, isn't it?
Sure. Yeah. So this is something a person like me would call selection bias, or non-random selection into treatment. People die in hospitals. The hospital's a bad place to go. That's because the people that go there are already quite sick. Right. So we can't just simply look at the raw numbers. We have to figure out, again, what's the appropriate counterfactual. It's not healthy people sitting at home. Right. It's people that were equally sick that didn't go to the hospital. And that makes it, there's a lot of judgment involved there. There's a lot of trying to convince your readers and convince the public that you're making a reasonable set of counterfactuals. And yeah, exactly right.
Economists have devised a whole range of different statistical methods to try to make these comparisons, and we're always devising new ones, and we'll talk about the ones that you applied here, a relatively new one. But what we could have, I mean, just as a first attempt to do this, you could say, like, well, let's look at how Venezuela did relative to some relevant comparison countries. Like, say, well, it's a Latin American country. You could look and say, like, let's compare it to other Latin American countries or other OPEC countries as at least a first way to try to compare. So what would work or not work about such a comparison?
Okay, so one thing that you could see right away from this chart that makes Venezuela so challenging is that at the beginning of this sample, Venezuela was rich. Mm-hmm. Venezuela was a pretty rich country. So, you know, it's richer than all the Latin American countries. It's more volatile than all the Latin American countries. Its volatility looks a lot more like OPEC, which makes sense because those are countries that rise and fall on oil prices. So just looking at Latin America for your counterfactual, you know, for what would happen, just compare Venezuela to Latin American average is, you know, not really going to work very well. The volatility is way different. And while OPEC has the same level of volatility or a similar level of volatility, it's a lot poorer too. So we're really, if we were just going to use OPEC, we'd really have to extrapolate a lot. And extrapolation is something economists or statisticians don't really like to do, especially that far away. All right, we'd like to be much closer. We'd like to have our counterfactual look like Venezuela, not just in the volatility, but also in the level.
And you know, certainly for years, and certainly back when I was in grad school, what we would have been learning is that you take a whole bunch of these countries and you do a statistical analysis on a whole bunch of them, and then like you have a control variable for maybe for countries that elected left-wing populist politicians. So you could run a multiple regression looking at determinants of GDP, and so that would be one way. And then you're trying to control for many different things, many different variables in a regression like that. And so that was obviously a far more sophisticated way economists would try to evaluate some of these questions, right?
Sure. Yeah, I wouldn't say that way is problem-free, but it has been the dominant approach in the last 20, 25 years, for sure. And I don't know how much you want to get into the weeds on that,
but no. So we have had trials to do a statistical analysis for this. But what we want to talk about now is a relatively new technique that's come into effect, and this is what you're using here, and it's a relatively new way to try to come up with this counterfactual, and it's called synthetic control. So tell us a little bit about what it is we're trying to do here.
Okay. So the way synthetic control works is you pick a set of potential counterfactuals. Mm-hmm. Those for our case, that's the list of countries in that first column. And you can see we've added in a couple richer countries because if you remember looking back at the previous graph, Venezuela was so much richer than the average Latin American or even the average OPEC country. So we've added in some oil exporting countries that are pretty rich, like Canada and Norway. Okay. The rest of the countries are either OPEC or Latin America, and then we need to have enough data that we can use them. Mm-hmm. So we want to then find some linear combination of these potential donor countries that best tracks Venezuela's economy before Chavez. Mm-hmm. And so we would then take our sample period from like 1960 to 1998 and use an algorithm to figure out what combination of countries. So rather than just picking, say, Argentina, right, or rather just picking Nicaragua or Nigeria, we would pick some linear combination of these countries that tracks Venezuela as closely as possible before the treatment happens, before Chavez happens. And in this case, you can see 20% on Canada, just because of the relative richness of mm-hmm. Venezuela, is going to put some weight on Canada or Norway or one of these richer countries. 42% on Iran, that's the OPEC oil volatility. And then Mexico, Peru, and Brazil add up to 35, 36%. So Latin America's there about a third. OPEC's there about 40%. And our rich countries there about 20%.
And so, I mean, you are like creating the idea of synthetic is you're picking little pieces from different countries for the entire thing of trying to match the GDP per capita in Venezuela prior to the event.
Right.
And
and then that's the way we get our counterfactual. Then what we'll do is we'll take those weights, and in 99, 2000, 2001, and 2002, our estimate of counterfactual Venezuela is just going to be the actual outcomes in Brazil, Canada, Iran, and Mexico. Those actual outcomes weighted by the weights we estimated in the pre-treatment period, that will give us our predicted outcome for Venezuela without Chavez.
Yeah.
Sort of business as usual outcome. Yeah.
And if you've got a long enough period of time beforehand that you're trying to fit this, I mean, then I guess one response somebody can always have is like, okay, it's just sort of like a statistical accident. You've got this group of countries that in the past have matched it well, but
Right.
what's the reason? But if it's a long enough period of time, then it starts to like, it could be an accident to match them for a couple of years, but if you match it well over a span of 30 years or so, then there's probably actually things that are similar in those countries that you are really tracking.
Right. This was invented by an economist named Alberto Abadie at Harvard, and he emphasizes very much a long pre-treatment period with a good fit is really important to establishing the credibility of what you're doing.
And another thing that you mentioned is important is your other countries that you're drawing from can't be subject to the same policy shock that would be involved here, because then you're sort of contaminating your control group, if you want to think of it from a laboratory experiment perspective.
Yes, absolutely. So, countries that say had a populist revolution after 1998 would be very bad countries to have in there, because they're getting the same policies as Chavez, and we would expect to see, we would misestimate or we'd get a biased estimate of the effect of Chavez. Absolutely.
So then, what you do is, so here's a graph sort of showing here, and I'll let you talk a little bit about exactly what this is showing. This is from your first paper looking at Venezuela, right. And this is GDP per capita that you're looking at here. So tell us what we're comparing here.
Okay, so we have a pre-treatment, the dotted vertical line is when Chavez takes over. Everything to the left of that is us using our algorithm to make that black dotted line look as much like the blue line as possible. Okay, those are the weights that we were discussing on the previous slide. Right. And here, I'm pretty happy with this. It's easy to do this for a country like the US, where basically line goes up all the time. But Venezuela is a pretty volatile economy, and you can see we pick up that big surge in the 70s and decline through the 90s and then a little bit of the turnaround. So that's a pretty good fit for a pre-treatment period. And then what we do is we just roll those pre-treatment weights on the post-treatment outcomes of the donor countries to get the black line on the other side of Chavez, and then the blue line is what actually happened with Chavez.
And once we look at this, you start to see, and this is a shorter period of sample. We had a picture up earlier showing this was before Venezuela's GDP really sort of took off there for a few years. But what we can really sort of see is that Venezuela wasn't doing as well as, in some sense, it should have. The synthetic control showed significant improvement in GDP per capita, which wasn't happening in Venezuela. Right?
That's exactly right. So that's the idea, right? So what's going on here in this time period is oil prices are starting to go up, right? And that should be driving. That's driving. Canada is getting richer because of that. Nigeria is Iran is getting richer because of that, and that's driving the synthetic up. That used to work in Venezuela. If you look back at 1970, there you can see. That's a surge from the first, from OPEC forming and getting teeth in the 70s. Right. So that surge at the beginning there is Venezuela growing rapidly because of oil prices, and the synthetic and Venezuela are matching each other. After 98, we get a similar kind of surge, but we don't get the same matching. We don't get Venezuela performing like it's counterfactual. And we would say, well, if the only thing that happened different was Chavez's policies, it's because of Chavez's policies that Venezuela is not living up to its potential.
In your paper, you discussed there were actually some things he did in the oil industry. You already mentioned some of them, but had some real effects in terms of their oil output. Wasn't as robust as it was after he put got rid of the engineers, put the political cronies in charge, and lo and behold, they weren't producing as much oil as they would have otherwise, and that could easily be a case where they were producing enough that the rising oil prices kept them from falling, but they didn't experience the same kind of gain that they probably should have.
Every Venezuelan president in the recent past had used the national oil company as a piggy bank to do things, but not to the extent that Chavez did. Chavez, just was very intent on funneling that money elsewhere, and maintenance got, exploration of new sites got delayed, maintenance was deferred and delayed, and production actually just didn't keep up. Yeah, that's right.
Well, there's a technique you talk about to sort of put together and try to see with what we're technically called placebo tests. But I mean, I guess my way of thinking about it is that if you look at an old data series and you want to know what you want to try to explain, in the past you can always, many times you can rig a model to explain what you've already observed. To some extent, it's to see going forward, and this is sort of like taking your potential control countries and seeing if anything similar to what we observed in Venezuela happens after the time of Chavez's election in Venezuela, right?
Yes, absolutely. So the gray squiggly lines are the deviations between the actual outcome and a synthetic predicted outcome in all of the countries in our donor pool, all those countries in that first column of the slide a few slides back. And the concern would be that, well, just something happened in 1998 that made the model go crazy. Like maybe in 1998, there was terrible weather in all of Latin America and shoved them down. But we don't see that. Right?
Yeah.
We see that it's Chavez's deviation there is by far the biggest. Mm-hmm. It's one of the better fits before 1998, and it's the worst fit after 1998.
Yeah, so that's suggesting, and so if all of those gray lines went like haywire afterwards, it diverged, then that would be a
right.
section. There's something weird was happening in all these different economies, but it was really Venezuela is the outlier there in terms of what happened to their performance relative to what you could do predicting it.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, Chavez, as he said, he was trying to take money perhaps from the oil industry to improve other outcomes in the economy. So, and many people would say, like, well, income isn't everything. There are other things that are important, especially poverty, the distribution of that income, health outcomes, especially for the poorer people in society. So you also look at some other broader measures of well-being, because although GDP correlates with a lot of stuff, but if your explicit goal is to do something other than growth, then it's not maybe fair to criticize somebody. You didn't achieve what you weren't trying to do, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So
if we look at these graphs, you can see if starting at the vertical line there on the graph on the left, which is infant mortality, Chavez inherited a situation of about 22, 23 infants dying out of 1,000 live births. At the end of our sample period, it's down to about 12 or 13. So yes, infant mortality fell under Chavez, but then if you just look back in the pre-Chavez period, you can see it's been falling continuously in Venezuela since 1970. So it's very hard to say, yes, infant mortality went down in Venezuela during the Chavez regime. It's very hard to say because of Chavez's policies, right? Because it wasn't Chavez's policies making it fall all that way from 1970 onward.
Yeah.
Same thing with life expectancy. If anything, with life expectancy, we see Venezuela underperforming. It's going up, but it's underperforming its synthetic prediction.
So again, they didn't do as well in terms of economic growth or GDP, and there doesn't appear to be any observable clear improvements that wouldn't be attributable to factors that were already going on,
That was the conclusion of our paper.
Yeah. We also, and so this is just extending a little bit to your second paper, where you also look at Venezuela in isolation. And this does include the period of time where GDP per capita starts to rise in Venezuela. But we still see that even when it starts to rise, it's not as high as the synthetic control suggests it should be.
Yes, that's exactly right. And if I could just take the liberty to point out, I don't have a counterfactual for this, but Venezuela's GDP per capita today is lower than when Chavez first took office in 1998.
Yeah, they've certainly had economic reversal since
Yes,
Chavez's
tragic
death.
one.
Yes, yeah, and a far more authoritarian turn. Well, you also look at several other Latin American countries, and one level one reason to do this is anytime you're looking at one country and one country and only one country, there's always other things you could throw in there as a possibility. That like maybe Chavez just wasn't a very effective populist leader, or any kind of personal issues, other kinds of things. Certainly with Nicaragua, I mean they were involved. The U.S. Through the Contras were fighting a war there that might have been bad for economic growth. So looking at several different Latin countries here would give you another way to look at this just more generally. Is there any evidence that some of the other populist Latin American politicians have done better?
Right. So this is the second paper that you so kindly put up at the beginning there that I've done with my spouse Robin and a different graduate student who now works at RAND, Sam Absher. The first graduate student on the first paper is a tenured professor at College of Charleston now, Norman Maynard. So I have to brag a little bit, sorry. What we did was we went back through the historical record of Latin America and looked for other leaders that had a policy mix like Chavez. And we came up with Nicaragua, which you'd already mentioned, Ecuador under Rafael Correa, and Bolivia under, oh my goodness, what's his name?
Morales.
Evo Morales.
Evo
There we
Morales.
go, Evo Morales. Right. Now, there are other leaders called populist in Latin America, in Argentina, like the Fernandezes, but they weren't able to implement the same kind of policies. They could never get re-election put in, and they couldn't end up changing the constitution. So we took Chavez's policy mix. We found all the cases we could find that matched. And then we ran synthetic controls on each individual one of them. Then we all lined them up in event time and looked at an average effect across these four countries. What's the average effect of this set of policies on economic performance?
Yeah. So we did have a slide there showing just sort of documenting. Yeah, indeed, they did have a lot of the same kind of constitutional changes that we talked about before. And so again, this is putting it all together across the four different observations here. And the story seems to be pretty similar. Again, now that GDP per capita went down on average, it does sort of go up, but not as fast as it should have been, I guess is the story here.
Yes. And in fact, you could say there at the end of that analysis period that on average, those four countries are 20% poorer than they had to be, or they're 20% less rich than they could have been.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Without that policy mix being implemented. Yeah.
And that's after about 8 years. So I mean, in a span of about 8 years, they've diverged 20% from where they could have been had they.
That's a big effect.
Yeah. And in 8 years, that's a pretty big effect after 8 years. Definitely. And again, I guess a part of this is to sort of say these policies have been tried more than once. And we're getting a pretty consistent story out of this. Again, using this very recent and new method that right now we think is quite good in terms of trying to come up with a good counterfactual for this.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, thanks very much for coming on and talk about this important issue with us. And thank you all for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.
This has been EconVersations, a joint production of Troy Trojan Vision and the Manuel H. Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University.